Okay, so now we are start.
Okay.
Okay, let me see my. OK， 好。Hello， 大家，感谢现场跟线上的一些朋友们参加我们这一次的讲座。参加我们这次科技艺术典藏基础计划的第二场系列讲座。我是计划的成员子权，另外一位跟我们一起在线上是计划主持人禹先，然后以及我们今天的讲者Jonathan。那在上次的讲座，我们听到 Annet Dekker 作为美术馆外的一个研究者对网络艺术保存维护的研究。今天我们调换角色，邀请身为美术馆内的媒体修复师 Jonathan 来分享他的经验。他同时他也是参与正属力网络艺术作品 Brandon 修复案例的主要成员之一。那 Jonathan 是我们在去年从美国 AIC 年会上面认识的一个修复师，他很大方的跟我们分享他自己工作上的知识还有经验。那今天他主要会针对 Computer-based Art 的保存维护做一个介绍，从他自己的学习背景一直到他担任古根汉美术馆的 Fellow 研究员助理的一个经验，跟作为修复师他面临 Computer-based Art 的挑战，然后还有像是跟其他科学、电脑科学等等的这个跨领域的合作的经验。那说到这边，大家可能觉得说网络艺术跟 Computer-based Art 好像没有什么太大的关联，可是其实网络艺术跟 Computer-based 是紧紧相连。那这部分我们就交给 Jonathan 等一下来跟大家做说明。最后，我们希望说藉由他的分享，可以让更多人了解说，到底媒体艺术要保存跟维护什么，然后修复师又扮演什么样的角色，以及跨领域合作的重要性。那接着我就先请禹先跟大家说明 Q&A 的进行方式。禹先。
OK，Hello，这次换我来说明就是 Slido 的部分。那因为我们这次使用的 Slido 的房间跟上一次的是一模一样的。那在线上的朋友如果进到我们的 Facebook 页面的话，可以找到那个号码。然后或者是说你搜寻 SLIDO 也可以进去，然后房间的号码是7036。那在进行当中，随时都可以打进任何的问题。那我们还是尽量使用英文来回答，来发问。那如果说真的没办法的话，我们现场会直接再把它翻译成英文这个样子。OK， 好，那如果没有什么问题的话 ，Now let's welcome Jonathan to give us a speech. Okay, thank you, Jonathan.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jonathan Farbowitz, and I'm the fellow in the conservation of computer-based art at the Guggenheim. Thank you very much for having me for this lecture. And I'm just going to switch over to my slides. Let me just share my screen here. And then we'll continue with the lecture. So here we go. So does everyone see my slides? All good?
Yes.
Okay, great. So my talk is about conserving computer-based artworks. And I've been working as a fellow at the Guggenheim for about 3 years now. So I'm going to talk about my background and how it prepared me for my fellowship, some of the challenges of conserving computer-based artworks, and how the Guggenheim's Conserving Computer-Based Art initiative and my fellowship are addressing some of the challenges to conserving computer-based artworks. And then finally, I'll describe some of the activities of my fellowship, ending with the importance of collaboration and continuing education in this field. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of my pre-programmed experiences before grad school that prepared me for the fellowship. So I worked in software testing, specifically video game testing, and this developed a very specific mindset, a kind of testing mindset. So when you're testing software, you're not necessarily always looking at how someone would normally use software, but you're often looking at edge cases or doing the opposite of what you're supposed to be doing and seeing what happens. So in a video game, if your character is supposed to be running forward to complete the mission, you run backward and then see what happens, see if you can crash it. And this experience is important, especially when I was testing code for our web art restorations, which I'll talk about in a minute. I also worked in software development, where I learned coding and understanding how to use version control software that helps you keep track of changes to code, and also understood the process of creating software from specification to final release. So this was a unique window into understanding how some of these computer-based artworks are produced. I also worked at a computer recycling nonprofit and did complete teardowns of Mac and PC computers, which definitely helped when you're physically working on artist-provided computers. And I also learned how to use Linux and the command line. And this is important because many digital preservation tools are either Linux only or command line only. So I attended graduate school at New York University's Moving Image Archiving and Preservation program. This is a 2-year master's program concerned with preserving film, video, audio, and digital files. So the concept of moving image in this program is very broad. So this graduate program gave me extensive coursework in digital preservation. And this is important because you have to understand conceptually what are the risks to digital information and how those risks can be addressed. And this coursework has a significant effect on my policy and workflow decisions in the fellowship. Also, the program gave me a kind of analytical mindset for computer systems and files, similar to how an art conservator would analyze the layers of paint to gain information about a painting. You can also look at digital files in a similar way. And the program also encouraged me to delve into emerging areas of preservation theory and practice. And I gravitated particularly toward digital preservation. And then also, finally, interdisciplinary exposure. So I was introduced to the practices and the ethical codes of different fields, including library and information science and art conservation. And through this exposure, I decided to attend the 2015 conference Tech Focus 3, which dealt with caring for software-based artworks. And this was really kind of a catalyzing experience where I decided at that point that I was interested in entering conservation. And after graduation, the fellowship at the Guggenheim was posted, and I felt like it was a great opportunity to use my skills. So first, just wanted to define what computer-based art is. Computer-based art is really a subset of time-based media art. So time-based media art is this broader category that includes artworks that use film, video, audio, and also software. So time-based media is any artwork that unfolds over time, that uses duration as part of the artwork. So within that, within time-based media, you have computer-based artworks. And these artworks use software or computer technologies themselves as an artistic medium. So not all artworks created with computers are considered computer-based art. So if an artist edits an image in Photoshop, just because they're using software to edit the image, it doesn't necessarily make it computer-based art. Software has to be integral to the concept of the piece. So I'm just going to show you one of my favorite examples of computer-based art, which is Unfolding Object. And that's the image at the top. That's on the slide, that's an image of Unfolding Object. It's a web artwork created by John F. Simon in 2002. And hopefully we can do a quick demo. So this is what Unfolding Object looks like. Does everyone see the artwork? You should see the web page. Let's see. Do you guys see it? Oh, hold on. Okay, there we go. So Unfolding Object, you have, this is, if you go to the URL unfoldingobject.guggenheim.org, this is what you'll see. And you have a larger rectangle and a small square inside. And if I click on the small square, it'll start to unfold. And I can unfold basically as much as I like in any direction. And it's gonna randomly generate these different shapes that represent the unfoldings. So this is just one example of a computer-based artwork. So I have two more on the slide. On the bottom left, we have Corey Archangel's Super Mario Clouds, where the artist took a Nintendo Super Mario cartridge and modified it so that when the cartridge is played, it only displays the clouds. And then on the bottom right is an artwork by Phoebe Washburn called Regulated Fool's Milk Meadow. This is a huge factory type installation, and it has a conveyor belt and watering stations and fans, all controlled by circuitry that was custom built by the artist technician. And it's running code that regulates all the machinery in the factory. And the purpose of the factory is to grow, you can kind of see on the conveyor belt down here, these boxes of grass. And the purpose of the factory is to grow these boxes of grass that will be placed on the factory roof. So this slide was intended to give you an idea of the diversity of computer-based artworks. So now we can discuss some of the challenges of conserving these artworks in a museum. So the major challenges that I want to talk about today are variability, aging hardware and storage media, obsolescence, and lack of proper documentation. And we'll talk about each one individually. So first, variability. In conservation, understanding what is called the original substance of an artwork is very important. So in order to understand how to properly store and treat a painting, a conservator has to know what all the layers of paint are, what the chemical composition of the paint is, and what kind of canvas or support was used. But the tricky part with time-based media artworks and computer-based artworks is that the equipment used and the form of presentation often vary by installation. So this slide has 3 separate installations of Paul Ramirez Jonas's work, Another Day. And I'm gonna just talk about what you're seeing here. So the artwork is a custom-made computer that runs code written by the artist, and it calculates the time to sunrise for different cities around the world relative to where the exhibition is being held. So you can see on the bottom right slide, it's saying, from there's 4 hours until sunrise in Singapore, et cetera, et cetera. So what we have here is also 3 different forms of presentation. So we have different types of televisions. They're different sizes. And it's not necessarily clear in these images, but the TVs are mounted at different heights in rooms of different sizes. So the challenge in terms of variability is thoroughly documenting all the iterations of how the artwork is installed, as well as maintaining the integrity of the artwork through many iterations. So Joanna Phillips, who's a former conservator of time-based media at the Guggenheim, and other time-based media conservators pioneered methods of documenting this variability. So each iteration, so each one of these 3 iterations of the work would be documented with an iteration report, which details all the equipment, all the specifications and measurements, the size of the room, the height that the TVs were mounted. And it also documents decision-making. So did the curator decide to mount the televisions at a certain height? Did the artist approve it? The iteration report also documents the reception. How happy was the artist with this iteration? How successful was this iteration? So this is all important because we have to understand sometimes even how the work might be evolving over time in different iterations. For computer-based works, you have the example here of different equipment used, but there's also another type of variability. For example, you have an internet artwork that might vary in appearance depending on which browser you open it in. And we still have yet to develop good systems for documenting this variability of display. So the other issue that I mentioned is aging hardware and storage media. So in this example at the top left, I decided to use as an example John F. Simon's color panel, which is a disassembled PowerBook 280C laptop that runs a program that was written by him. So on the top left, you have the artwork, and on the top right is just an example of what the laptop actually looked like before it was disassembled and mounted by the artist. So we have a case now where this artwork is now dependent on a 20-year-old computer running properly. This is obviously a major vulnerability because actually Simon created the work in 1999, but the laptop was already obsolete by 1997. So again, a major vulnerability because these pieces of equipment were not built to last for very long. It's really a piece of consumer equipment. So in addition to hardware, you also have storage media that can experience data loss due to deterioration. So in my bottom photo, I have different types of floppy disks. And so the issue here is that the disk might become too old and deteriorated and the data can't be read off of it anymore. So in the case of these disks, you have to migrate the data off of this vulnerable storage media and then store several copies in your digital repository, in your safe storage. So another issue being hardware and software obsolescence. So computer-based artworks are inherently technology-dependent works. And of course, as we know, technology is changing all the time. Hardware and software becomes obsolete. So these images are just to note different types of obsolescence. So on the left, you have HyperCard. This would be an example of file format obsolescence, where the file format is too old and can't be read by contemporary computers. I chose HyperCard because it's a very old format for legacy Macintosh computers, and some artworks were actually created with HyperCard. In the middle is an example of software obsolescence, where the program or the operating system can't run on contemporary computers. So you have Windows XP, which couldn't be run on a current computer except via something like an emulator virtual machine, but this would also be obsolete software. On the right, you have storage media obsolescence. So a case where you have a hard drive that's so old that uses an unusual type of connection that's not employed anymore, so that it's not possible to connect up the drive to contemporary equipment. So you be an example where you couldn't find the proper adapters to hook this drive up to a contemporary computer and get the data off. So this is an example of an old SCSI drive. Fortunately, we actually were able to find enough adapters to get the data off of this, but it could definitely be a case in a few years where that might not be possible. Oh, sorry. One other thing I wanted to note on this slide is that sometimes technological dependencies are external to the artwork. So if an artwork pulls information from a website, it could cease to function if the website disappears or changes how it handles requests for data. And if we don't have the source code, the original code that the artist or their programmer wrote, we may not even know what the technological dependencies are, and we may not be able to have any strategies to prevent obsolescence. So the other risk would be lack of proper documentation. When you have potentially thousands of files that look very similar, you need ways of understanding the significance of those different files. So on the left, I have an example where you have all of these different file folders, but it's not clear what any of them really mean. And I've often run into situations where I have a computer that's filled with test files or different versions of an artwork, and it's not clear which files are actually running the artwork, or what the files are and what role they play in the artwork. So yeah, we definitely want to prevent the situation where we're not clear on the files that are actually being used. On the right side, we have a case of some kind of unknown executable file where potentially a conservator, because they don't have enough documentation, don't know what role this executable plays in the artwork. One thing that I've learned through the course of my fellowship is that you can have tons of documentation for a computer-based artwork, but if you don't necessarily have the right kind of documentation, you can still get into trouble. So you could have every spec of a computer, but again, like not know which file is actually running the artwork. Or you might have extensive detail about each of the iterations, but you might not have a very good summary of how the overall artwork actually functions. Okay, so I'm going to move on to talk about how we can address some of these risks. First of all of these risks mean you can't have a passive preservation strategy. You have to have an active one. You can't take a hard drive or an artist-provided computer and put it on a shelf in storage and then hope to take it out later. You need to be especially active during acquisition because you need to understand the piece and also ask for the right components the right resources that will aid you in preserving the work over time. And it's also best to document the work running properly as installed, especially for computer-based art, because when it's in the gallery and it's functioning properly, you don't necessarily know when that will happen again, when it's all working. So you should really take advantage of that opportunity to document as much as you can while the piece is working. Also, in my experience at the Guggenheim, I've seen how caring for computer-based art has to be a holistic initiative, and staff has to work across departments and disciplines. So conservation, curatorial, IT, registrar, and even development, making sure to raise money for staffing to address these issues. So it's very important to bring in as many people as possible in collaboration. When you're talking about conserving computer-based art, you're also talking about digital preservation, which involves a series of ongoing maintenance activities. So once you have the files off that floppy disk, it's not once and done. You have to be actively monitoring your storage. And also, most art museums, including the Guggenheim, have to go back and look at works that were previously collected and understand the preservation vulnerabilities and also what can be done to better care for them. So assessing works that were previously collected, that's been a central task of my fellowship and the larger Conserving Computer-Based Art initiative at the museum. So I'm just going to leave a couple minutes here for questions. If anyone's lost at this point or wants some clarification. Do we have any questions, or should I?
I actually have one question.
Sure, yeah.
I'm thinking about the mindset change from your previous work as a software testing engineer and then jump to conservator. What's the biggest changing of mindset?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Mm-hmm.
So I think one thing is in terms of like when you're actually doing different coding projects in conservation, there's not so much of a, like especially the restoration projects that we've done, you know, you're not trying to make a better thing. You're trying to basically restore and make the artwork appear, you know, roughly as it was when it was first created. So I think a lot of times in software development, you can often say like, oh, this has this huge bug. We can just completely change this thing and start from scratch. There's a lot of tendency to do that, just start over. And it's just not something that is part of my conservation work, that mentality of just starting over from scratch. You know, if we're restoring an artwork, we have to obviously keep as much as we possibly can in terms of the original.
Further to this, roughly, you mean even if that artwork is not created in a very sustainable way?
Oh yeah, good question.
And you still want to keep that on perfectness.
Yeah, so if it's not created in a very sustainable way, I think that then maybe becomes a conversation with the artist. And we'll talk about Brandon in the next lecture. But there were some places when we restored Brandon where we were actually eliminating software dependencies. So we were making it more sustainable. But again, that was always in conversation with the artist. So there were small things we did, but we definitely didn't start over from scratch, but we eliminated things like, for example, there was a database in there that wasn't necessary anymore. So we eliminated that because that would be an additional software dependency that would have to be carried over. And we didn't necessarily want to do that.
Cheang, you have anything?
Yeah, in your slide, you said 4 challenges for computer-based art. And I want to ask is like, which one you think is the most important one or most the challenge in computer-based art?
Like what type of computer-based art is the most challenging?
Mm-hmm. Or yeah, one is list and another is like you list the 4 challenges.
Oh
yeah.
Yeah. So what is it? Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. I think they're all super challenging, but if I had to pick one, it would probably be the obsolescence problem. I think that one really puts you in a tight spot because, you know, all of these artists, they're often using what's the latest technology at the time, and they're not necessarily thinking about sustainability. And especially with web-based artworks, you have cases where it's like the artwork functioning is so fragile because, you know, they're using some kind of call to Twitter, and, you know, if Twitter changes how people call it for information in even a small way, then the artwork breaks. So yeah, I think the obsolescence issue, especially with web-based artworks, can be a real killer, because it's making it thinking like, Facebook is going to last forever, or Twitter is going to last forever, but that's not always the case.
But for now, it's like conservators all still find a solution to resolve this problem, right? Can you hear me?
Oh, sorry, I missed a little bit. Sorry.
I mean, for this question, now all the conservators all like to search the perfect, or not the perfect, the solution to this. I mean,
yeah, I think that in terms of the solutions, it's really a case-by-case situation. It's just you have to go individually and look at each artwork and really examine what can be done, depending on what the artist thinks. Maybe, in some future situation, there's ways to kind of emulate the internet or emulate certain websites. I think actually that's an interesting possibility in the future for a lot of these web artworks. But we're not quite there yet, unfortunately. So I think we really have to go. And even if we did have emulation for certain websites or web services, we'd have to go case by case and really look individually at what the artist thinks is acceptable. So,
okay.
So should I continue on, or?
Yeah, you can continue on. Yeah.
Okay. All right, let me go back to the screen sharing. Okay. So now I'm going to talk briefly about the Conserving Computer-Based Art Initiative at the Guggenheim, a little bit about the history of it. So this initiative is within the conservation department. And at last count, in the Guggenheim's permanent collection, we have 28 computer-based artworks that date from 1989 to the present and use a variety of different technologies. Around 2013, Joanna Phillips, who was the conservator of Time-based Media at that time, saw the need to address the preservation of these works. And she started collaborating with Professor Dina Engel, who's a computer science professor at NYU, and her students, Dina's students, started to examine artworks. And so this is still an ongoing initiative, and Dina still leads an independent study every semester, looking at a case study artwork, and I support the students each semester in their research. Usually they're looking at the source code of computer-based artwork. So this is the original code that the programmer or the artist wrote. And they're annotating that source code so that conservators can understand the logic of the program, and so that we can make responsible decisions about the artwork in the future. And students in the independent study have also been delving into other projects. So for two of our web artworks, the students prototyped code migrations. Code migration meaning rewriting the code in a different programming language. And later, we hired 2 students to work as programmers on restorations. And next week, I'll be presenting with Emma Dixon, who is an NYU student and also the programmer on the restoration of Brandon. So my fellowship, the CCBA fellowship, started in 2016. And the goals were to back up all computer-based artworks. So this would address the problem of the aging hardware and storage media. You get that data off so that you're not as worried about that storage media failing. Also, I was asked to analyze and treat selected artworks. So this gets into the restorations of our web artworks. And then also I was deriving standardized methods for collection care and new acquisitions. So having better methods for new acquisitions is also working on that problem of a lack of documentation. So I'm going to talk about my overall activities as the CCBA fellow and zoom in on a couple of activities. So I have to communicate regularly with computer programmers, technicians, and our IT department. And this is where my professional background becomes very important. So in the top left image, this is an example of artist and technician interviews. So again, we're trying to address the documentation problem here. And through these interviews, we learn much more about the technical composition of the artwork and the artwork's behaviors. And also through these interviews with artists and technicians, we try to understand the potential variability of the work over time. And we start to understand, we start to define the work, what components we're going to preserve, what are we going to store, and also the parameters for future exhibition. The interviews also help us define how we address the obsolescence problem and aging hardware problem. So how does the artist conceive of addressing changing technology? And part of the interview, like in this case, in this photo on the left, could be the technician walking us through the logic of the code while we record video. And then finally, the interview also helps us define deliverables that the artist needs to give us, and also helps with creating a preservation strategy. Because with computer-based artworks, we often have to create lists of deliverables for the museum from scratch. These are the preservation elements that the artist is going to provide to us as part of the acquisition. Standards are difficult here because these computer-based artworks often vary dramatically in what technologies they're using and how they use it. But in general, we do want the source code for the artwork because that's the original code that the artist or their programmer wrote. So in the right image, this is me with Emma Dixon, who was working on the restoration of web artwork Brandon. And I was using my software testing background to continually test Emma's code. And next week, we'll talk about how we attempted to apply conservation ethics to the restoration. So some other activities include disk imaging for preservation. So this solves this tries to address the aging storage media issue. So I'm disassembling the computer here to extract the hard drive in the bottom left image. And then on the right, creating a disk image. So a disk image is a bit-for-bit copy of all the data on that hard drive as usually a single digital file. So you can do disk images for hard drives, you can do disk images for floppy disks or optical disks like CDs or DVDs. And a disk imaging software reads all the physical space on that hard drive, including space that wasn't even necessarily used by the operating system. So we know we have everything from that hard drive if we use disk imaging software. You'll also notice it's a little bit hard to see, but we have this hard drive is hooked up to a write blocker on the computer. The write blocker prevents the computer that's creating the disk image from writing anything to the hard drive. Because this hard drive was given to us by the artist in the artist-provided computer, and we consider it historical evidence, so we don't want to modify that drive at all. The disk image format also helps you keep all this data from this hard drive encapsulated. So it's preserving the folder structure, the file names, and all the metadata like the modified dates of different files. So other activities that I've done would be researching an artwork's technical history in the Guggenheim's archives. So I'm not just sitting in front of a computer screen, but sometimes even going back into the archives and trying to understand the history of a work. And then also part of the fellowship involves presenting my research publicly. One of the most intensive aspects of my work is defining policies for computer-based artworks. So the policies are informed both by technical understanding and also understanding digital preservation principles. So things like establishing naming conventions for components of an artwork, and defining workflows, let's say, for disk imaging. So I'm conducting a lot of research on the fly to examine the pros and cons of different decisions, like what file format should we use for our disk images? What do we call this component of an artwork? And how much and what kind of technical information should we save about a particular artist-provided computer? So once all the data is backed up, as I mentioned, our job isn't necessarily over, and we have to think about, for our institution, digital preservation policies. So in this image, I have the NDSA levels of preservation. I'm putting this here because I think it's a valuable advocacy tool, and it's often easy for non-specialists to understand, to map where your institution is in terms of digital preservation. So on the left side, this is different kind of digital preservation topics. And then on the right, going across here, or on the top and going across, are the different levels. So you have level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. And I think what this chart is really valuable for, and you can find it online, it was developed by the National Digital Stewardship Alliance. And I think the levels are a good way to try to improve digital preservation at your institution without feeling like you need to do everything all at once. So that's why things are broken down into these levels. So sometimes conservators need to intervene when an artwork isn't functioning anymore. It could be something like resoldering a wire, or it could be recoding software. And one example of treatment that I've done in the fellowship is the restoration of Brandon, again, which we're going to talk about soon in the next lecture. So the Guggenheim doesn't stop collecting computer-based artworks, and we've recently acquired a virtual reality work, and also we're intending to acquire an app-based artwork. So because there are all these new types of technologies that are coming into the collection, it's important to really think about continuing education and also collaborating with other fields and applying knowledge from related fields. So, for example, with disk imaging, we're using the practices from a field called digital forensics. And also libraries and archives have done a lot of research and development on using digital forensics for collection items, which conservation can benefit from this research and development already done by libraries and archives. As I mentioned, we have an ongoing collaboration with computer science, but I would also add that we should really be paying attention to what's happening in software development and testing. So through understanding what software developers are doing, we can better understand how these artworks were created and also integrate existing tools as methods of documentation, such as version control, which we used in the Brandon restoration, and we'll get into in more detail in the next lecture. And I wanted to also mention that all of this work happens with a team. So in the large photo on the left is Joanna Phillips, who was instrumental in orienting me to conservation and helping me understand proper documentation for time-based media artworks. And on the right, in that large image, is Dina Engel, who is also a mentor. And then I just wanted to mention peer exchange with some of my colleagues, Alex Nichols at the top, who is a former Crest Fellow at the Guggenheim, and Megan Perry in the middle, who's a former graduate intern, and at the bottom right, Maurice Schechter, who provides some advice on electronics, which is important for my work. I also am continually exchanging information and with other colleagues in conservation through the electronic media group of the American Institute of Conservation. Because even with this small collection of computer-based art, it's really not possible to be an expert in all the technologies used. And as I mentioned, we keep collecting artworks with new technologies or different technologies. So really being a conservator of computer-based art is a commitment to perpetual learning. Especially with technology, you really need to exercise some humility and admit what you don't know and find people who can help guide you. And that also leads into continuing education and technical training. So microcontrollers and custom electronics were really outside of my education and work experience. But I've been enhancing my knowledge of these things through different workshops on Arduino. And also I've been attending conferences and other events to learn from makers, like Maker Faire, and also digital archivists and hackers as well. So all of this education for me really needs to keep going, because I never know what the museum is going to collect and what new challenges I'm going to be presented with. So thank you for listening, and at this point I'll take any other questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. There we go. Okay.
Okay, so I saw some few questions, and one question is like, have you any suggest for the person who wants to be like time-based media art or computer-based art conservator?
Yeah, I have a lot of suggestions. I think like in terms of time-based media, I mean, unfortunately, there aren't too many training programs. So, you know, I came out of the MEOP program at NYU, which is not a traditional conservation program, but I do think it was actually really, really important for my education and my knowledge. So maybe one option is going through that program. The Institute of Fine Arts at NYU also now has a time-based media specialty. So that's another route to go if you want to do a more traditional conservation program. There's also a time-based media program at Bern University in Switzerland. Although that one is called Modern Materials and Media, so it's not exclusively focused on media. But I think other things to think about are also not just formal education, but also understanding how these things are made. So if you're particularly interested in computer-based art, it would definitely benefit you to be studying coding, software development, how people are doing that. And in terms of time-based media, you would want to be studying you know, video making, filmmaking. I think it's a huge benefit to understand like how these things are actually created. And that helps you understand how to preserve them, I think, way better. And then also, maybe you're interested in custom electronics, so then you can do some experiments with Arduinos and other types of circuits. That's definitely valuable experience to have because you have a lot of artworks that use custom circuitry.
Okay, I want to follow up with this question because, I'm also like an associate Time-based Media Conservator in M+, but I always think about the industry of technology is all, every engineer have their own specialties, but as a conservator, you have to somehow specialize, a little bit specialize in all kinds of different technology.
Mm-hmm.
And in most cases of the museum, I think you are already being lucky to have a time-based media conservator in the museum. Yeah. So many museums, they don't really have the time-based media conservator, or is covered by other conservation conservators. And I'm wondering, current stage of the Guggenheim's conservation team, do you think is the team size and the specialties is capable to taking care of what museums wanted to collect and to maintain and for the current collection? Do you think the Guggenheim's team is like big enough to?
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, so Joanna left the museum in January, unfortunately. So, we're down a time-based media conservator. So, at the moment, no. But I would say before we had a much larger team. So we had Joanna, me as the computer-based art fellow, Maurice is our video engineer. So he was working on a lot of quality control of video art that came in. And then we also had at least one other fellow, either Alex or Megan. So, at that point, I think we were in good shape. And we had enough expertise really to be able to handle a lot of things that came in, and enough staff. But yeah, I totally understand the challenge, because even if you had a ton of staff, you wouldn't necessarily have people who are expert in everything. And so that also means, even in the case of the Guggenheim, occasionally we have to bring in different consultants who specialize in certain type of software, or, like, for example, we brought in Emma to work on, as a programmer, to work on the restoration. So it's just to say that we always have cases where we have to bring in outside consultants. And I think probably any museum would have to do that occasionally, no matter how much staff you have. So it is, it is very challenging, because of that issue of you have all these different technologies used and nobody can be an expert in everything. And, even, and in some cases, even if you did have some knowledge about something, you might still want to hire a consultant because, working on a piece may pull you away from other things that are important, and you may just want a consultant to handle that. So does that answer your question, or?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I'm just trying to scale, if a museum have a chance to develop their team and the scale, and also giving suggestion to museums that they do not have maybe not even a conservator for any type of medium to deal with this collections.
Right. Yeah, I know there are quite a few museums in the United States that they don't have a time-based media conservator, so the time-based media is either handled by a photo conservator or by an objects conservator who, you know, happens to have some experience in time-based media, but it's sometimes a little bit of a stretch, but it just has to work that way because they can't afford dedicated staff for time-based media, or maybe their collection isn't big enough to justify dedicated staff.
Yeah, I understand. I saw there are questions on the Slido that says, usually when is the artist interview happened?
Oh, when does the artist interview happen? Yeah, good question. Usually that's at acquisition. So it's kind of a required part of our acquisition procedure that the artist make themselves available for an interview. It's basically like written into the contract when we acquire something. So yeah, at acquisition.
I have another question about the collaboration list. Question is follow the last question we just discussion. In this year in AIC, you and the other museums conservator have a collaboration project. So how is in this case how it start? And it's common it's common that with the other conservator to cooperation.
Yeah, so I guess it started because you know, disc imaging, and this was just to get everybody oriented. You're referring to, we had a panel at AIC this year that was on disc imaging in conservation, and it was me and Eddie Colleton at the Hirshhorn and Caroline Gill and Flaminia Fortunato at MoMA, and we decided to do this cross-institutional panel. It started back, I think it was around 2 years ago, because disc imaging was something very new for art museums. I mean, it wasn't new for IT, it wasn't new for archives, but it was very new to conservation. MoMA decided to host what's called a peer forum on disc imaging. And so MoMA invited a bunch of technical experts and also staff from different museums, New York museums and other museums around the world. And we all sat in this peer forum for 2 days and discussed disc imaging. But I think there was a sense after that peer forum, like, while the peer forum was super helpful, we didn't necessarily come away with a lot of kind of concrete standards, or we came away, I think, maybe with more questions rather than answers. So after that forum, Eddie and Caroline and Flaminia and I basically all got together and said, like, you know, we're all working on disc imaging in our institutions because we have to, because that's kind of part of our jobs. But we want to build on that peer forum, and we also want to present in a way, you know, present publicly what we found in our experience. So that's how that started, and I think the cross-institutional part, I think, made it made for a more like powerful panel. Like, oh, these are, you know, it's not just one person from one institution saying this is how we do it. You get different perspectives from different institutions, and I think that made the presentation stronger. Because, you know, we don't agree on everything either.
Okay. Thank you very much. According the time, we are almost ending.
Okay.
So thank you again. So now is our ending. So 现场的观众跟现场的朋友大家好，就是我们今天的讲座就到此告一个段落。那希望说我们在下一个礼拜三，7月24号的时候也会还有另外一场讲座，是针对网络艺术作品，郑淑丽的 Brandon 由 Jonathan 跟他的同事会一同来比较详细的针对这件作品的一个保存维护的案例来做讨论，这样子。谢谢大家。Thank you, Jonathan. We are end of this. Yeah.
OK， 荣安，你们现场。